We give you advance notice that that group is planning in 2014 to have a major exhibition on the effect of World War I on Stamford. So without any further ado, can I thank you for your indulgence, and Alan, perhaps I can hand it over to you and you will talk about William Browne. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, John, and thank you all very much for coming, and I hope that I can live up to your expectations. Just a word, if I may, before I get into it. I came to Stamford not for the first time, but first time in a working capacity in 1960, and as a University of Nottingham resident tutor. And one of the things which struck me was that Stamford was actually, I'm a medievalist mainly, though as a local historian you tend to work right the way through all sorts of other periods. But one of the things which struck me most was that Stamford in the Middle Ages was actually one of the most important towns in the country. And yet it didn't appear in the history books. And I tried to struggle with this, why not? And one of the reasons was that in terms of the medieval period, there aren't very many records that are easily available. And so one of the things which we were intending to do, particularly through the Stamford Survey Group, was to get records into the public domain, printed, so that people can research the history and write the history of Stamford, which has never really been done. Now, I'm just doing one little bit of it, which is my own specialist period, which is the 15th century. But the 13th century was the great period, and we now have enough documentation for someone to do a really good study of the period when Stamford was right at the top, at the peak of its power and reputation internationally. Stamford was known in Italy, in Germany, in Poland, on the Baltic. When you wanted to settle your debts internationally with merchants, you say, "I'll see you at Stamford Fair." And so that has never been written up. We've also never really had a good history of Stamford in the 18th century, when it was a great social centre with the theatre and the assembly rooms and so on for the whole region around. And of course the 19th century with the big industrial developments here, that has never really been written. Bits of it been written up, but never really. So what I was really hoping for, and what trying to do, was to get Stamford on the historian's map. Now, in the course of doing this over the 50-odd years and so on, I just want to say a quick word, to say how grateful I am to a considerable number of people and organisations, especially the Town Hall and the Town Council and the Town Hall staff, and the access they gave me to the records that were there at the time, particularly to Browne's Hospital and the trustees there, particularly to the sadly lamented museum, who did enormous amount of good in the town. And I just can't understand why it is that Grantham can get their museum back, but Stamford has not yet got it back, not even seem to be moving to get it back. But, you know, the museum was enormously helpful to me, and above all, of course, to the members of the survey group, whom I harried and chivied and instructed and insisted that they produce their work on time, and they did, and I'm very grateful to them. But let me get on and so on, and I do hope that I'm not blocking too many people's view of the screen if we go on there. If you were to turn round and have a look at that window at the back there, William Browne put that window in, and at the bottom of the window on that side, the bottom light there, on the north side, he put the arms of the Borough Council. And on the bottom of the light on that side, he put the arms of the Calais staple. Now, I want to take those two things and talk about those today, about William Browne's engagement with those two. There's a lot more that could be said about William Browne, and I hope I've said a lot more in the book. But these are the two that I really just want to concentrate on. So first of all, William Browne and the Calais staple. William Browne was a wool merchant. That means he was a wool exporter. You don't call a wool merchant somebody who buys wool locally and sells it on the English market. The word merchant in the 15th century meant an exporter. And if you're going to export wool, you have to sell it in Calais. Because Calais was part of England. It was not part of France. And it was the town in which the king decided that the wool would be sold there. All the wool for the continent would be sold there, so that he could tax it. And the easiest way of doing that was to get the merchants to form themselves into a company. So they formed the Company of the Calais Staple, right? But of course that involved them in the French War. France wanted to reconquer Normandy again, which the English had taken back again, and so on. And so, of course, Calais was regularly surrounded by that. And that meant there had to be a military presence there, and somebody had to pay for it. And so the easiest way to do that was to get the Calais staplers to pay for it, instead of paying some of their taxes on the wool. And so the Calais staplers were getting involved heavily in the politics of the period. Well, William Browne was born, we don't know when he was born, I've estimated it at about 1410, and he died in 1489, so you can see he lived a good long time, almost the whole of the 15th century, right? But it was a dreadful period. There was, we talk about having a great recession at the moment. Let me tell you, there was a huge recession in the middle of the 15th century, what's called by historians the Great Slump. Because of the war, there was piracy on the Channel, and they were encouraged by both governments to raid each other's ships. The weather was disastrous, some of the worst weather England has known between the prehistoric period and today. And of course, there was the period of civil war, the Wars of the Roses. So, at the bottom there you've got the capture of Calais, at the bottom there, if this thing will work. If that's the capture of Calais, and that is the beheading of the Duke of Somerset, which of course most of the battles of the Wars of the Roses were merely political assassinations. So, William Browne was a wool merchant. But how did he operate then from Stamford? Well, he traded through Ipswich initially, sent his wool from Stamford, which is there, to Ipswich, so they go to Calais. One of the shortest routes, even a better route than London. He also did some trading from London. But then he switched and he traded from Boston. Most of his ships now went from Boston, probably because it was a better route for getting the wool from there. But he had a sister, Alice, and she was married into the two leading families in Coventry. And William Browne and John Browne, his brother, they both helped Alice very much, because she got married twice. And on both occasions, William and John Browne were involved in her marriage settlement. So he was definitely in Coventry. And then he married his daughter to the Elms family of Henley-on-Thames, who were also Calais staplers, and who turn out, we now know, to have a wool hall in Southampton. So William Browne's area of operation were all those places, as well as London. But, you know, he travelled, he must have travelled enormously around that. This is the brass, so you can hardly see it at the bottom here, but there's a brass here in the church here, to Alice Bredmedew, formerly sister of William Browne. Not relict of Robert Bradmedew. Her husband didn't count. Her brother counted much more. In fact, he probably bought the brass for her. Okay, so he came from a long line of wool merchants in the town. John Browne, a whole series of John Brownes there. But they were drapers, and they were also engaged in the wool, the home wool trade. There's no evidence that they exported at all, but they were engaged in the wool trade. And it was William Browne's father, John Browne, who built the wool hall, his wool hall. Now, there's a leaflet that's going around the town which says that William Browne's wool hall is over the big hall that is over the Central Cafe and over Dawson's Jewellers. It isn't. That's wrong. I don't know who wrote it, but it's wrong. It's in the wrong parish, for one thing. It's also the wrong date. It's that one is not 1422, it's about 1370s, 1380s. So on. William Browne's wool hall was almost certainly under what is now Red Lion Square, which was built up all the time, and obviously has now gone. So William Browne was born in about 1410, but he took over the firm in 1432 or 33, in other words, at the age of about 22 or 23. And for the first 2 years, he described himself as a draper, like his father. But from the middle of the 1440s, he drops the term draper, and he only calls himself a merchant and a Calais stapler, and he concentrated on the wool exports. And so I've got here just one of the many extracts, not many extracts, one of the few extracts we've got. We do have some extracts of his ship. In 1463, in December 1463, a ship called the George of Lynn left Boston. These are sailings from Boston, they were, left for the Calais staple. And William Browne denizen had 27 1/4 sacks and 10 cloves of wool. And I know somebody's going to ask me what a clove is, and I know that 3 or 4 times in the last few days I've said to myself, I must look clove up and make sure that I know what it is, and I've forgotten to look it up. But it's a subdivision of a wool sack, and I don't know exactly how it's done. And John Browne, his brother, also. Now on the same day, the shipper John Gregory, called the Gabriel of Boston, left. William Browne had 14 sacks on that one, and John had 8. And then another one, the George of Boston, left on the same day. They left in fleets in order to deal with piracy. Okay? And he had 13. And when we do look at some of these, William Browne is one of the biggest traders of wool out of Boston. On one trading fleet we've got, he had over 10% of all the wool that was exported on that particular day. So, oh, sorry, I did mean to show you this. I must show you this. I don't know if many of you can see this little sheet there, but it's up there somewhere. Is it that one? I think it's that one there. William Browne undoubtedly put it in, and Rob took photograph of it for me, for which many thanks, Rob, for that. But it's a lovely thing that's hidden away, William Browne's sheep. And even this is his merchant mark. And the interesting thing is that the family merchant mark is this one here, but you see William Browne and his brother put a difference on it. 2 wings. And here's a seal which William Browne himself actually put onto a title deed, and you can see the mark of the seal very clearly. And then you can find it also on this Book of Hours. Can you see the mark there? Right, William Browne's mark. This is John Browne. This is a Book of Hours that John Browne, William Browne's brother, commissioned from Bruges. And it's unfortunately now in America. John Browne said that. And this is an indication. William Browne, the point that the Calais staple is that it opened people like William Browne to continental culture. William Browne himself had several books. We only know of one of them in detail, which was a book about anchoresses, about recluses, about the life of a hermit, which suggests for a very busy man rushing around, he wanted to have a time of reflection, quiet reflection himself. And he also acquired to several what are called nuts, coconut cups that are in silver and coconut, which came from the continent. And one of them he clearly valued so much that he left it as a family heirloom, and we've got it down to the 5th generation, still described as William Browne's heirloom. Now, what about the role that William Browne, however, played in the staple was not just as a trader. We don't know a great deal about the staple. There's very, very few records. In fact, there's virtually no records of the staple have survived. There were about 250 to 300 members. They made loans to the government, and the first occasion we find William Browne engaged as a stapler, he was giving big loans, very big loans. He was the 3rd biggest lender amongst the staplers in the 1440s. And he was therefore given a license to export wool free of customs, first through Ipswich and then through Boston. But we also find him as a leader of syndicates of merchants, groups of merchants that get together and trade together. And William Browne was the leader of these. He was probably on the council of the staple as early as 1459, because there's a lawsuit in which he is cited as somebody who is supporting the chief defendant in the lawsuit. And the list of people sounds as though it's the council. And then he became the mayor of the staple. Now that is the chief officer. And we don't know for how long he served. It may be that he served 1 year, but he may have served 2, 3, 4 years. But it must have involved him in an enormous amount of work. This is the Staple Hall in... Where's this? That's interesting. Oh, well. I've got a stick in case I hadn't got this thing. Sorry. This is the Staple Hall in Calais, right? And he must have spent a great deal of time there, travelling between there and London, in order to negotiate with the king. They had to negotiate currencies. The wool was being bought in continental currencies. Calais had a mint, and the money that they bought had to go to the mint, and the mint had to make new coins. You had to get coins from London. He would negotiate with the kings about the rates of tax and so on. How he managed to fit this all in, I don't know. And he also did a lot of other things as well. This is a number of... there is the white somewhere. Oh, there it is. This is a number of people that are Calais staplers in York Minster windows. But the answer is we don't know very much about them, and I wish we knew much more about it. But he was a leading light in the Calais staple. But the staple was much more to William Browne than just a trading company and a company on which he served on the board as the executive. I think it was a social cachet. He used the term merchant of the Calais staple. As you see, he put the arms in the window of this church because it was so important to him. But one of the most important things is the brass to his father. His father died in 1442, and William Browne bought a brass which consisted of 2 figures, a man and a woman. But he didn't put an inscription to that brass. Where is it, John? Is it there or there? It's over there, that side. And he didn't put an inscription to that till his mother died, because he wanted to put his date of his mother's death on it, see? And she didn't die for 18 years, so he had to wait for quite a long time. But when he did, he put onto it not only the merchant's marks there, there's one there on both sides, but he also put on it that he was a merchant stapler, a merchant at the staple of Calais. There's no evidence at all that his father was a Calais stapler. In fact, I think it's probably a bit unlikely that he was. But William Browne wanted to claim that he was after his death, and which is something which was done quite regularly. So anyway, that's William Browne and the Calais staple. Now let's come to William Browne and the other side of the window, his relationship with his town. And that is actually, I think, quite remarkable. And what I want to do, first of all, is just say, what sort of town was it that he did? Well, first of all, we tend to think of Stamford as a town on the Great North Road. But in the medieval period, although it was on the Great North Road, that wasn't the most important thing. It was on the Great Midland Road. The Great Road from Coventry, Leicester, came to Stamford, ended at Stamford, and the goods that were going abroad were put on the water here in Stamford, with the wharfs on both sides of the river, below the bridge, and they went down the river to Boston and to Lynn and out that way. So Stamford was a great east-west, and you can see this if you compare Stamford with Grantham. On the left there's a picture of Grantham, and you can see the Great North Road going straight through, or just up the side of this, right? You don't get a straight through road in Stamford, I assure you. Those of you who are old like me and remember coming through the town before 1961 know what a nightmare it was to get through the town. You have to wind away. If you remember, Red Lion Square was completely built up, right? Then you really are in very narrow, windy road. Why? Because all the east-west roads are wide. All the north-south roads are very narrow, with the exception of Ironmonger Street, which was a market area. Right? Stamford was an east-west town. And the main road between here and then Leicester and Coventry was what I call a corridor. There were several different alternative ways you could go. One went through Oakham. And if you think about Oakham, Oakham is an east-west town as well. And the other one went through Uppingham. And if you think of Uppingham, that's an east-west town as well. Not a north-south town at all. And so Stamford was an inland port at the end of the Coventry Road. But secondly, we think of Stamford as having a medieval core. And in a way it has still got it, and it's very useful. But three major changes have gone since William Browne's day. The first is the castle. Now it's very difficult for us to envisage the castle, but this is a view from Rock Terrace, looking south. And you can see the castle towering up above the town. And that was 1900. So in the 15th century it would have been even bigger. You know, it had been out of commission for many, many years. So the castle really dominated the town, but it's gone. Secondly, there were 14 parish churches. We've only got 5. You call yourself having a lot of parish churches here with 5. Imagine what it was like with 14 of them, all over the place, right? But much more important was the area of the friaries at the eastern area here. They've gone. 3 big friaries and 1 priory, St Leonard's Priory, of which a little bit remains. If you think to yourself of 4 Oxford colleges dumped just outside the walls, that's what you had when William Browne was here. It was a major, major centre. They were very large buildings indeed. Which is why the king came to Stamford to hold councils here. He usually resided in the Grey Friars because it was the biggest and Richard II's mother was buried there, and there was a Richard II chapel. The Richard II chapel is gone. Think of the quality of a Richard II chapel, you know, in Grey Friars. But it's gone. Everything's gone. All the friars have gone. Lots and lots of people, noble people, were buried in these friars. And so the king, in 1309 and again in 1392, held parliament here in Stamford. And he lived and stayed and in 1337, he brought the whole government here for 3 months. Right? And they were all housed mainly in the friary area. And then so you've got the 3 areas of Stamford. You've got what I call the ecclesiastical quarters on the east. You've got the castle with the King's Manor and the King's Mill there. There was, by the way, a friary there as well. It's a much smaller one. And in between, you've got the big market area. And this is the big trading area and industrial area. And that was the town that Stamford, that he lived in. And the distinction you can see that what was going on in William Browne's time, you can see compared with the 13th century. In the 13th century, they built very, very nice, substantial, but very small workshop houses, like those on the north side of St Paul Street, which still remain, bits of them. They got all sorts of alterations and new fronts on them and so on, but they're largely 13th century. But this is the sort of place they were building in the 15th century. Much bigger, much more elaborate. And what seems to have happened is that in the 15th century, wealth became congregated in the hands of a very few people who could afford to build really big, prosperous houses. In the 13th century, wealth was much more widely distributed amongst the population. That's my guess. We don't know enough about 13th century yet. Okay, William Browne lived in this town. First of all, he was town councillor. And he was town councillor from a very, very early stage. That's why he wasn't just the town councillor, he was the leader of the council. His name came first, William Browne. Right? In the list of all the 12 of the town council, every time it appears. He was always this. This is unusual. In most medieval towns, the person who was named first was the outgoing mayor or alderman. But note in this case, William Browne's name comes up first every time. He was alderman, that is mayor. In those days they called the mayor the alderman. Right? He was mayor, if you like, 6 times. The first time, he was only aged about 25. He succeeded his father, he took over the father's business in 1432 and was elected mayor of the town 2 or 3 years later. Here's a man going somewhere fast, quick. He was a mayor or alderman in 1444, and then he was called upon at times of trouble. In 1449 and 1450, Richard Duke of York, who owned Stamford, didn't come here very much and didn't really bother very much about it. He was too busy dealing with Fotheringay down the road. That was his main centre. But he started, 1449-50 was the first of the Richard Duke of York's rebellions against Henry VI. So what they do? They turn to William Browne. Again, 1460 was the big rebellion, when Richard Duke of York got killed and Edward, his son, younger son, became Edward IV and deposed Henry VI. And the town of Stamford is supposed to have been sacked, by the Lancastrian army coming through. Again, they turned to William Browne to become the alderman. 1466, he was alderman again, and then in 1470 was again the big crisis year of Edward IV's reign. When Edward IV was turned off the throne and ran away onto the continent, they brought Henry VI out for a few months, dusted him down, put him on the crown, decided he couldn't possibly manage it, and then Edward re-invaded and came back. It was all started off by a battle just outside Empingham called the Battle of Losecoat Field. So what happens is they turn to William Browne to become the alderman. He was the person they would turn to steer us through the town through difficult times. I think he must have been a fairly arrogant man. In the Hall book, there are 2 entries there when he was alderman in 1467, where he actually writes down and says, so and so and so and so came before me to give me an obligation for keeping the peace, a recognizance, as they called it. Coram me, give it to me. Me? Who's me? William Browne, the alderman. Normally, the minute would say, this person came before the alderman and gave the alderman. But here in the official borough records, William Browne is writing, he came before me. He admitted that one of the jobs of the alderman was to admit new freemen. And I still can't quite make this one out. He admitted virtually no new freemen when he was alderman. In one of his 2 years, he admitted 4, and in the second time, he admitted none at all. Whereas Robert Hans, a fishmonger, who was alderman on several occasions, on 2 occasions, admitted 26 freemen on each occasion that he was there. So why William Browne seems to have deliberately restricted the number of freemen, I don't know. But he was not a party man. He was not going to get involved in the wars of the Lancaster against York, not going to get involved in the White Rose against this. So much so that in 1470 and 71, when he was alderman, he sent troops from Stamford to both sides of the Civil War. And in 1480s, even when he was getting really, really old in the 1480s, there was clearly a big row going on in the council. I wished we got more details, but it says that William Browne, with a group of other councillors, took the town seal away from the town clerk and locked it in a chest. And I think it is actually that chest which is still in the town hall. And he locked it in the chest and said it wasn't to be used except with the consent of 3 people, one of whom each had a key for it. So clearly there was something going on. He was a hands-on councillor. But he also gave voluntary support. Just after he ended one of his periods for that, he gave the town council some jail instruments. In primis, 3 collars of iron with chains and staples fastened to one piece of timber was to go into the town jail. And there were other things, chains and things that he gave. And on another occasion, when the town MPs came to the town council and said, please can we have our expenses, and the town council, as they usually do, say we haven't got any money to do it, William Browne lent them the money, but he then tried to get it, he did manage to get it back from the town council. But he was the person that you would turn to. But he wasn't only a town councillor. As John Plum was saying, and one of the most important features of the medieval town are the parish guilds. Stamford did not have any craft guilds, but they did have lots of parish guilds. And whenever we come across the parish guilds, we nearly always find that William Browne is prominent there, and indeed is the alderman or the leader of them. We know that he was the alderman of the most important guild of all, the Guild of Corpus Christi and St Mary, that met in St Mary's Church, and the guild that did the plays, the town plays. He was the alderman of the Holy Trinity Guild, he was the alderman of the Guild of All Saints, which met in this church here, and he was the alderman of St Catherine's Guild, which met in St Paul's Church, and which supported the anchoress at St Paul's. We only know of William Browne joining any guild outside of Stamford on one occasion, and that was in Boston. And I think there are special circumstances here. I don't think this was William Browne's request. I think this was Margaret Browne's request, because it says that William Browne, Margaret Browne, and Agnes Browne, Margaret's sister, the 2 brothers, John Browne and William Browne, married sisters, Margaret Stocks and Agnes Stocks. And they were very close together, as you'll see in a minute. And the 2 women wanted to join the Corpus Christi Guild at Boston, and so William went along. But what happened? He joined in 1476. 1481, he's elected as alderman of the Boston Guild. He's the sort of person who comes to the top wherever you are. He made his fortune not just through the wool trade. He did make a lot of money through the wool trade, there's no doubt about it. Even as late as the 1480s, we can find him trading out of London. But he also made his money through money lending. And we know, I won't go into the details here, but he lent to the government, he lent to local lords, he lent to local tradesmen, especially to other merchants. And in particular, he engaged in a lot of mortgaging of property, and then foreclosing on a good deal of it. And we know that he kept a red book written in his own handwriting for these loans. But he also then built up a lot of property. When he died, he divided his estates. Half of them went to Browne's Hospital and half of them went to his daughter, Elizabeth, his only surviving offspring, who married into the Elms family of Lilford. And he divided his property in half. Now, he gave 17 properties in Stamford to Browne's Hospital, which suggests if he really did divide them in half, he must have had something like 30 properties in Stamford. And he also had 7 manors and lands in 30 to 40 villages round. But some time ago, I did this little map here, which is the area. There's All Saints Church. Over here is All Saints Vicarage. And John Browne had the house on the north side of the vicarage, and William Browne had the 2 properties on the south side. And then William Browne moved round the corner and he set up himself in a big house right next door to the area where Browne's Hospital is now. And when you work it out on the map, there is this solid block of property, which is the Browne's property, with All Saints Vicarage in the middle. And if I tell you that the Vicar of All Saints was Margaret Browne's brother, you can see, and indeed the vicarage was built sometime in the late 15th century, so I feel sure that William Browne had a hand in that as well. So that, you can see that bit of property is really the Browne, part of the Browne interest. But that is not the only. They're scattered all over in Stamford, Browne, south of the river, as in all the parishes. William Browne had properties in Stamford. But he also acquired property outside in the countryside. I'm sorry this map's got a bit slipping. I tried to put 2 maps on top of each other and I couldn't quite do it. But you can see there's a big concentration of estates north of Stamford is here. Big concentration in South Lincolnshire here. There's one manor here in Rutland, the manor of Woolfox, but there were other properties there. I think actually that's North Luffenham where he had properties. And then in Northamptonshire he built up a lot of properties there. And but William Browne did not go out into the countryside to live as a country gentleman. He could have done, could quite easily have moved out and settled on. His cousin, his nephew, Christopher Browne, who, by the way, was buried in that... No, we don't know he was buried, but he put his brasses in their chapel there, but I'll come to that in a minute. Christopher Browne bought Tolthorpe Manor, and he got himself a coat of arms, and he called himself Christopher Browne, Esquire of Tolthorpe. And so he moved out, and which is what lots of other merchants did. William Browne didn't. He stayed right through to the end, and he called himself always William Browne of Stamford. And he spent his money in the town. I mean, apart from buying the property, the properties were in fact income coming in. And particularly on building. And the bits that we know about are All Saints Church, Browne's Hospital and St Catherine's Guildhall. And there were probably others. And he certainly gave considerable support to the anchoress at St Paul's Church there. So, okay, he built this church, but he didn't actually. The reputation that he built this church, that he did a great deal of work to this church, has been slightly exaggerated. What he did was he put new windows in there, he did a good deal of reconstruction of that chapel there, and he put new windows in there, and he built the tower. But he didn't touch the arcades, didn't touch the interior here at all. And the whole foundation, he didn't extend it. This is not like St John's Church, which was pulled right down and completely rebuilt, and St Martin's Church, which was pulled right down and completely rebuilt. William Browne didn't. Does that tell us something about him? That he was nostalgic, he was a bit old-fashioned, perhaps he wanted to stick with what was there? I don't know. So, and then one of the big things about William Browne was that he put in about 8 or 9 brasses to different members of his family as well as to himself. And this is a brass there. The part of that, the rebuilding, is that John Browne, William Browne's father, had taken this end of the North Aisle and probably put a partition across there, and that was the chapel of St Thomas a Becket, and that was the burial chapel of the Browne family, all except William Browne and his chosen friend. He chose the Lady Chapel here, which he rebuilt, and it does, if you go outside and have a look, you can see that the roof level of the roof level here of the Lady Chapel is not the same as the roof level of the aisles, right? It's rather bigger. So he probably enlarged that for himself. And he left detailed instructions in his will exactly where he wanted to be buried, even to the extent of saying, I want my feet to be located between the wall and the holy water stoop. So he laid out exactly where he wanted to be buried in this. So that was the burial chapel of William Browne. And then there's Browne's Hospital. And Browne's Hospital, again, is rather old-fashioned. It's not like the normal one. This is a drawing of it before the alterations were done in 1870, which make it into the present building that it is. It was a very old-fashioned type of hospital. 10 poor men sleeping on the ground floor in cubicles with open access into the chapel. They can't actually see into the chapel because they had actually had wooden partitions up. In other ones like that, they sometimes only had curtains up so that they could lie in bed and actually see into the chapel. But at least they were inside the whole building. As somebody once said, these sort of hospitals are rather like the poor people sleeping in the nave of the church. And it was exactly like that. Right? But upstairs, this room here, which is called the auditorium, there's the chapel, which runs through 2 stories. But up here, that wasn't the hall where the poor beadsmen ate. They ate in a hall in a building at the back. That was the guild hall of All Saints Parish Guild, of which William Browne was the alderman. Now, William Browne built it, and he built it as a guild hall and hospital, but he built it on his land, he built it with his money, not the guild's money. He maintained it with his own money all the time he and his life, and Margaret was very active in supporting the hospital during that period. And when he came to endow it, he endowed it with his land. Now, he didn't quite finish it. And by the way, there was also a school. He built a school in there. We've only just recently discovered that. We don't know where the school was, but it describes, the accounts describe as being the schoolhouse on the hospital site. So he put a school in it as well. Now, he didn't just develop this as he developed this as a guild hall for the guild there, and he was the alderman, but he didn't draw any real distinction, as I think he didn't when he was alderman of the borough. Coram me, come speaking before me. I don't think he drew any distinction between himself and the guild. As far as he was concerned, he was supporting the guild, right? But when he didn't quite finish it before he died, and so his brother-in-law, Thomas Stocks, who was the vicar of All Saints and the vicar of, or rector of Easton-on-the-Hill as well, he finished off the hospital. And I think Thomas Stocks was the person who did this. When he wrote the statutes, he wrote the guild out of it completely. They had no say whatsoever in running the hospital. And I think the argument was, well, all the money came from William Browne. Why should the guild have it? Okay, when William Browne died, his grandson, William Elmes, became the alderman of All Saints Guild. William Elmes, however, died young of the sweating sickness, quite young. And Christopher Browne, as the oldest member of the Browne family, became the alderman of the All Saints Guild. And the hospital closed the door to the guild, locked them out, put a padlock on the pantry where all the guild silver was. So the guild took them to court, and there's a long lawsuit, which it looks as though the hospital lost, and the guild was given the right to come there. But all sorts of interesting things came through from that lawsuit there. But this was William Browne's intention. Going back one stage, I think, and I argue in the book, that what really sparked this off, and I think this is an indication of something about William Browne, was that in 1471, William and Margaret Browne's oldest granddaughter, Margaret Elmes, died. She was probably about 9. She could have been younger, but she can't have been any older than 9. But she was still only very young. And what did happen? William Browne made a brass for her and put her brass there. Now that shows that death of one of the children really touched them. And I think it is that, 1471, the death of Margaret Elmes, that made him and Margaret in 1475 build this hospital. So he was a great family man. He looked after Alice, his sister, in Coventry when she got married twice, and then when she was widowed in the end, he brought her back to Stamford and she lived here, and her brass too is also in that chapel. Margaret, his granddaughter, I've just mentioned, and when his brother John died, Agnes, Margaret's sister, William Browne was looking after her as well. And Margaret, you can quite clearly see, was very much a partner with her. She engaged in farming, and she certainly engaged in money lending in her own right and kept her own accounts. And William Browne died in April 1489, and Margaret Browne died in October 1489. And I think that gives you an indication. They were, I think, very close indeed. So, okay, what am I to make of this? I'm arguing that William Browne fulfilled the life of a merchant. He didn't, although he did serve as the Sheriff of Rutland on 3 occasions, and even on 1 occasion as the Sheriff of Lincolnshire. Just try and think of yourself, how you run of being a Sheriff of Lincolnshire from Stamford here, and what travelling that would have involved him. And that was in the 1470s, when he was in his 60s. You know. So he was active right through to the end. But he did not seek to become what he wasn't. He didn't have a coat of arms, despite the arms that are in the glass in Browne's Hospital. They are all up after his death, and they're what we call posthumous ascription of arms to him. But he didn't seek coats of arms like Christopher did. Christopher, as soon as he sort of came to Stamford and inherited his father's wealth, took out the coat of arms on the grounds that the family didn't have any coat of arms. So what William Browne did was that he used a wool sack, or he used his merchant mark, and his wife, Margaret Stocks, used a stalk, which also appears in the glass in Browne's Hospital. So, John Leland, an antiquarian of Henry VIII's reign, sometime between 1530 and 1540, that is 40 or 50 years after William Browne died, wrote of him, he was a merchant of a very wonderful richness, and he lived in hac aetate, meaning in this very age. In other words, he was somebody contemporary, the friend. So that some men be alive that have seen him. Now just think about that. 40 to 50 years later, there were some men in Stamford who said, when I was a little boy, I saw William Browne. Which leads me to think that he was probably an impressive character. He may have been tall, he may have been big, but he was certainly extremely well known. One of his friends, William Fairfax, out at Deepingate, wrote in his sort of journal thing about William Browne, and on 2 occasions, not just once, but 2 occasions, he described him as noble merchant, nobilis mercator, a noble merchant. Now I think the fact that it comes twice means that I think it was a title that was being used of William Browne. And I'm arguing that William, he being a merchant was good enough. He was noble in its own right. He did not need to become an esquire or a knight. He was a merchant, but he was a merchant of the Calais stable. But above all, he was deeply, deeply committed to Stamford. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you have heard this evening 2 things about Alan. One, his fascination with the past and his ability to bring it to life. And many of us have benefited over the years from that. and personally, and some of us here would thank you for that. But we've also seen this evening that mastery of detail. You know, oh, that we could pull things out of the hat, as it were, and present them in that coherent way. And actually, most of this has come from Latin documents of tortuous handwriting rather than straightforward, nice typescripts. And you saw some of it there. Alan, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for all you've done in Stamford, and thank you for a very good evening.
Don't give it away. Professor Rogers, thank you for an interesting talk. It was very good. I can relate to see when I was a schoolboy, I did actually go, we had a classroom when I went at St Michael's at Browne Hospital at the site, where we went to learn, whatever we learned. Good. But can I, on behalf of Stamford Town Council, thank you very much for all the work you've done for Stamford, and we'd like to give you a little token of our appreciation of something we've done, and also...
Oh, how lovely.
And thank you very much, and long may it continue.
The arms of the borough. Can I, on behalf, just for myself, please, give to you a copy of the book For the Town Hall?
Yes. All right. Thank you very much. Well, we have some good books in the town. All this will be treasured among them.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. And while I'm doing that, making a presentation, I wonder if Pam Sharp would come up. I'd like to give a copy particularly to Browne's Hospital because of all the work that they have done. And Pam in particular has been absolutely terrific in responding very quickly to urgent emails. Please, Pam, what does this mean, or what happens there? So, Pam, if you would come and let me give you a copy of the book For Browne's Hospital.
Thank you, Alan. I hope that has proved a memorable evening for a man who has contributed so much to our understanding of the history of this town. For coming in such very large numbers, really has been splendid to see so many people turn out. Can I invite you, and there are rather a lot of you, so it's going to be an almighty queue. There's a glass of wine in the corner. Even more important than that is the special offer tonight of Alan's book for £15. And in case you haven't got a copy of the other books that I waved at earlier, or the more recent ones, shall I say, there are also some copies on sale of those at the back. We look forward to your patronage. Thank you very much for coming.